Now, I have a problem with every single personal computer being sold today, and it doesn't matter if it's running Macintosh, or if it's running Windows, or if it's running Linux. They're all using the same interface. They're all using an interface that was called originally WIMP, Windows, icons, menus, and a pointer, or you can call it a GUI. In either case, you're talking about an interface that was first created in 1973. And this was famously invented at Xerox PARC. And I think everybody might know the story about how Steve Jobs got his inspiration for the Macintosh after seeing this. But keep in mind, this was in 1973. A computer user from that time who used the Xerox Alto could jump forward in time to today, sit down at a Windows machine or a Mac, and recognize everything as being essentially what they had then. And you could go use that now and be pretty comfortable with what you're looking at. Now, to give you an idea of just how long ago this was 36 years ago. This was 3 years before the first Apple I was sold. Not the Apple II, the first Apple I wasn't going to come for another 3 years. So this Xerox Alto in 1973, where Windows were first introduced, was about the size of a small refrigerator. You can see it sitting under the desk there. And cost about the same amount as a suburban ranch house at the time. It had 128K of RAM, and it actually had a hard drive. It had 2.5 megabytes hard drive, so it's a couple of floppy disks for everybody that remembers the most recent floppy disks. In the intervening 36 years, we've been through 18 Moore's Law doublings, meaning that we now have literally millions of times the power, millions of times the speed, millions of times the storage space that we had at that point. We have things that computers technically can do today that would absolutely blow the minds of anybody from 1973. But we're still using the same interface. So I'm proposing that we start over.
Punch card.
Punch cards are good. I'm proposing that we start over, and this idea is called Lightful. I'm going to start with what the name means and where it comes from. If anybody's familiar with Bucky Fuller, this was actually his word that he coined in 1928 in an unpublished manuscript. And if you're familiar with Bucky Fuller, you might know him as the inventor of the geodesic dome, creator of the Dymaxion car, the Dymaxion house, the Dymaxion world map. But before everything was Dymaxion, Bucky had a few different words that he used, and one of them was Lightful. And he used it to refer to his lightful houses at the time. And these were houses that were full of light. They were lightweight. And they were delightful. And also, if you know about Bucky Fuller, then you'll know that he believed that if you worked for the betterment of humanity, that the universe will take care of you. Now, we're talking about computers here. We're not necessarily talking about the betterment of all humanity, but then again, if you think about what computers are doing to us today, it's not so far-fetched. So one thing that I found really interesting recently, I discovered a paper written by some researchers at UCLA about 3 years ago. And they were looking at a part of the brain that I had to write up here so I could remember it. But this is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is the part of the brain that lights up when you're in physical pain. If you have ever heard of somebody who's had chronic pain and they've had surgery to have that taken care of, they might have had this part of their brain actually removed to a certain point so that they can still feel the pain, but they don't mind it anymore, is the strange thing. Well, what these researchers found out was that this part of the brain, which responds to physical pain, also responds to emotional pain, such as social rejection. And what was really interesting, unfortunately, they discovered some of the emotional pain through some pretty cruel animal experiments, but also through some human experiments. And what was really interesting was that they found out that a computer's rejection hurt just as much as a human's rejection. Now, I work in advertising. I've spent the past 14 years as an interaction designer. But now that I've been the user experience director over at a company called Wonderman on Madison Avenue for a couple of years, I've seen this a lot. Now, I feel the exact same way about computers. I think that if any of us spoke to one another or acted to one another the way that our computers do to us, we wouldn't just be considered rude. We might be considered antisocial or actually psychotic. So what can we do about this? Before I answer, I want to give a word about the environment and another problem that I think is partially a result of bad user experience. So the EPA in 2007 figured out how much money we're spending every year as a nation leaving our computers on, our office equipment, but mostly our personal computers. $2.5 billion in electricity every year. So some researchers at the Technologic University of Malaysia took a look at this, and they said, what are some things that can be done to reduce this? And they set up two different groups. The first group, they had use a power management scheme. The users didn't have to do anything. The computer did it all, put it to sleep, all the kind of things that we're fairly familiar with. And the other group, without any power management, was given a sticker. The sticker was put on the computer saying, turn it off. When you're done, turn it off. So the power management, after a few weeks, they discovered that it saved about 17%. Pretty good, but that's kind of what we're getting now. Turning the computers off saved 30%. And that's pretty good against $2.5 billion a year in electricity, but are your computers on 70% of the time then? Are you using your computer 70% of the day? 17 hours a day, are you sitting there being productive? You haven't gone to the bathroom, you haven't gotten anything to eat, I doubt it. So why did the computer stay on for 70% of the time? That's because shutting a computer down is not an easy task. If you want to shut down a computer, you have to make sure you've saved all your files, that you've gone through all the processes you need to go through, that the computer's happy with you, because if you didn't do something that it demands, it's just not going to obey you. You have to babysit this machine. It's a very final act, and it's not the kind of thing you're going to do when you're just getting up to go for a sandwich. So can you imagine if shutting off a computer was exactly as simple and fast and easy and reversible as a light switch? Can you imagine what that would do for electricity usage? It's not just as a matter of technology, though, because it's the user interface, as I just showed you. So if we're going to look at this, we might as well look at the whole thing. And in the spirit of looking at the whole thing, I want to bring up Jeff Raskin, who some people might be familiar with as the father of the Macintosh. He's most famous to me as the creator of the idea of the humane interface. And that was the name of his book, and this was his first law of computer interaction. And so what I've done is I've gone back and I've looked at a lot of the things that Jeff Raskin has written and talked about, and all the other people that I think are pioneers in the same field of making sure that computers work for humans and not the other way around. And some of the ideas that they've put forth in the past, some things have been adopted, such as the Maya hotbox that you see on the left, and some things that still haven't, like the tool glass that you see in the middle there that's being used at Xerox PARC right now, and said, what are the ideas that we can actually take and use if we were to start completely over? And I've put together a series of principles, and this is what I believe it takes to have a truly lightful interface. And can I get a time check, because I want to make sure I don't... Okay, so I have all the time in the world. So I'll quickly go through what the principles of a lightful interface are, and you can go to lightful.org and all these things will be explained a bit more. But the first one is that it be modeless. And just a brief explanation of a mode for anybody who's not a user experience specialist. A system can be said to be modal anytime that you are performing the same action on the same object, but you get a different outcome. And so that could be as simple as your car radio is set to clock mode instead of volume mode and you break your ears. Or it could be something more dastardly, such as a radio-controlled airplane that has a mode that determines whether pushing this way pushes the plane up or pushes it down. The point is modes cause errors, and a lightful user system should be modeless. And it should be monotonous. And this is a word I took from Jeff Raskin. And monotony, as a design principle, means that there's one way to do something. And you'll find that in a modern computer system, and I use modern in air quotes, but in a modern computer system, there's about 6 different ways to do any particular thing. And it's partially because of backwards compatibility, which if you take the word compatibility away, it tells the whole story. And it's partially because you have turf wars, you have various things going on, and what you end up with is a user who's confused and spends more time thinking about which way to do it than just doing it. And subservient. Now I very particularly chose this word instead of user-friendly, because we've tried user-friendly before. And user-friendly is just the opposite of user subservience. User subservience assumes that your users are intelligent, and it assumes that they're busy. And unfortunately, most things do just the opposite. Interruptible, which should be fairly self-explanatory, but unfortunately most computers haven't figured this out yet. There is nothing that your computer is doing that's more important than what you want to be doing right now, and there's nothing that it should take precedence over. Persistent, when you go away and you come back, it should be the way you left it. You'd be surprised how often that's not the case. Forgiving. There should be no such thing as an unforgivable error. If users feel that every action they take is reversible, then they'll be more bold, they'll be able to work faster, and they'll be more efficient. It should be visible, and this means that the system should always be visible at any time. You should never be having anything hidden from you. If you want to know what the computer is doing, it needs to be visible to you, and it needs to be invisible, meaning that the interface needs to go away when it's not needed. The interface is not there to show itself off to you. It's there to do one thing, and that's to help you enjoy your entertainment, get your work done, or whatever else you're choosing to do with your machine at that time. So one thing I'd like to ask out of everybody is, after this talk or any time, go to lightful.org, and you'll find these printed, or you can print these out from there. I'd like to ask you to put these next to your computer and just watch for a few days how many times your PC or Mac or Linux machine violates all of these principles. So there's some things we've learned in the 36 years since we first used the Windows icons mouse pointer interface. And one of the things we've learned is that computers are not going to replace everything. They're not going to replace all the paper that we have in the world. This is my notes getting ready for the talk just before I flew out here the other day. There's no way I could have done this, I could have thought this way on a computer screen. They're all too small or they're too big. They're not going to replace human interaction. Just like television didn't replace radio, it supplanted it, it gave radio a new place. Computers aren't going to replace paper, they're not going to replace human interaction, they're not going to replace our offices. It's okay, it's understandable. This is what usually happens with a new technology. We go through a period of being very excited about it, and at one point, this picture from 1901 shows electric flying trolley cars, which I think kind of sums it up when it comes to how we expect new technology to change everything. You can't see this very well, but what this is a picture of a system called Starfire, which actually was just a brilliant design from Bruce Tognazzini. But what was wrong about this design is not his fault. He assumed that everybody was going to be trying to do virtual offices, and so he tried to create a machine that would let you have the world of your office in a single screen, place to put up your pictures, etc. And to be fair, this is because that's exactly what in 1994 people were talking about. This is some pictures from Chiat Day, which was an ad agency that chose to go totally virtual. They took away the computers, they took away the phones, they took away the desks. You would check something out in the morning, you'd go to your locker, and the idea was that maybe you'd go down to the beach, work at the beach, get a lot done, be very creative, and check it back in at the end of the day. And of course there was a rebellion within about a year. It reminds me of something that when I was in high school, we had a career day. I think everybody had a career day. And they ask you a series of questions. What do you like? What are you good at? These types of things. And one of the questions was, do you like to work outside? And I thought, absolutely. And this is what I imagined. Well, these sound like great ideas, but the truth is there's a reason that we work in offices. There's a reason we wear the clothes we do and we do the things that we do. The clothes that we wear, the environments that we're in, these say a lot about not just what we're saying to other people, but they influence our behavior and our thinking. So if you look at how a computer dresses, look at how an interface dresses, what is this saying? How does it want to act? Who has that interface actually been created for? And I think I have a pretty good idea. So Edward Tufte has a phrase you might have heard called chart junk, and he's specifically referring to information design in this case, but it's excessive decoration. In the case of information design, usually you'll see this happen when the designers don't feel that the data is interesting enough, and so they feel they need to dress it up a bit. And Tufte's solution is, don't dress up the edges, make your data better. And in a user interface, chart junk happens like this. And what chart junk does is it takes your attention away from what you're trying to actually do. What you're seeing here is a turf war. This is a turf war between engineers, programmers, designers, business managers. Everybody's fighting to get their selves heard. And the user's not in the room at that point, so it's no surprise that they're the ones that lose in this turf war. Again, excessive decoration is nothing new. It's something that happens with new technologies. Computers are still new to us. This is still a brave new world, and we're still trying these things out, and we're still trying to get to the place where things make sense. One of the things we hear about the most right now is information overload, as my phone rings, to prove the point. One of the things we hear about the most right now is information overload. And people assume that information overload is what's responsible for a lot of the things that are going wrong. We can't process data as well in our minds as we used to be. I think everybody thinks the next generation is getting stupider, but they might actually be. They're not able to keep knowledge, to understand what they've read, to focus on one thing at a time. But I say that it's not just information overload, it's that we can't concentrate. Our interfaces are actually taking away our ability to think. They're interfering with us all the time, popping up with things that we don't actually need to know. Irrelevant pieces of information that the computer has decided need to take precedence over the focus that we are trying to pay attention to. One of my favorite apps on my Macintosh is a little thing called Think. And it's just a little hack, a little kludge that basically allows you to turn down the lights on everything that you're not currently using. I love it. I use it all the time. It lets me think. But how sad that that had to be invented in the first place. This is a quote from Alan Kay that you might have heard before. Steve Jobs likes to use it, and I think he's right. I think it makes a very good point about the connection between the entire system. And so what I'm here to do today is to ask people to become part of an open source project, which is called Lightful. And this is not an open source project for one piece of software, and it's not an open source project for an operating system. It's an open source project for a completely new system. Everything from hardware to software and everything in between. One of the things that we've seen is that people are very concerned about backwards compatibility, and I agree it's important, but this is the only time it's important. The only thing that you have to make sure that you do not damage is your own work. You don't owe any allegiance to any system or any operating system or any machine that came before. It owes allegiance to your data. So what Lightful is intended to do is to give us back our lives, to disappear. And some of the things that have advanced in technology, of course, we can take advantage of. I think multi-touch is one of the greatest things that has happened to computing probably since Douglas Engelbart decided to make a mouse. But we've seen that with all the multi-touch interfaces, especially Microsoft Surface, they don't have any usability principles behind them. And it's fine. Engineers are making it, and they're making wonderful things. But we can find a way to actually build principles for this. And multi-touch isn't the be-all and end-all, because sometimes you do want a stylus. Sometimes you actually would want to use a brush, and there's nothing wrong with being able to pick up a brush and use it on your screen. If you're going to use a screen, I didn't have time to make a 3D model, but here's a sketch out of my notebook. But there's nothing natural about having a screen at 90 degrees in front of you and holding a remote-controlled little sled on a string to try to tell it what to happen. Instead, we should be looking at something that can sit at the angle of a book, sit at the angle of a drafting table, sit at a natural reading angle, and that you can work with in that same angle. So I know we're running short on time, so I won't go too much into the specific details, but these are a number of proposals that I'm making for executional imperatives for Lightful. And some of the things on there you might be familiar with hearing before, some of the things might be new, some might be controversial, some might be obvious, but they all basically boil down into these three things. And that is to make a system that is based on direct manipulation rather than remote, abstract, to make a document-centric rather than application-centric system, to make a system that's infinitely persistent. And this one's actually really important because one of the things, I think I've got a little bit of time left, one of the things that's happening in technology is as we move from hard disks and platters to solid-state memory, we're also moving to a lot less concern with volatile versus permanent memory. So some of the things that are being done, for example, on a e-ink, you've seen it on the Amazon Kindle, you've seen it on the Sony Reader, what's being done with the ink there can be done in the same way with the memory itself. There's no need anymore to write to and take away from each time. So you can actually have a system that gets rid of the artificial concepts of saving and closing and these types of things. And of course, finally, that it be 100% user subservient. So what I'm asking for is for people who are on this list, which is pretty much everybody who is interested in being a part of this, to go to lightful.org and sign up and see how you can help make a part of the future.